if we're going to be joined by Councilwoman Gordon or Councilwoman Naeem. And then we'll get started.
Councilmember Naeem just joined the meeting.
Great. Hello, Councilwoman Naeem.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Let me turn this down some. All right. I think it is now 10:02. I will call the meeting to order. And we have in attendance, let me call the roll here. We have Councilman Walton.
Present.
Present. Councilman Jefferson.
Present.
Councilwoman Naeem.
Present.
Councilwoman Gordon. Not yet. And Ed Shirley, I'm here. And we also have Director Clay, Attorney Matravy. We have Ms. Morris, and I think we have Chairwoman Comer. Correct?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And we also have present representatives from the University of Connecticut who will make a presentation today, the subject of our meeting. Before we do that, shall we take a minute to review the August minutes? And I will take a motion to accept them.
So moved.
Get a second?
Second.
All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. So this morning, the policy committee is going to discuss the DIA consensus track and the options that are available to the Social Equity Council. And with that, Director Clay, shall I turn the meeting over to the representatives from the from University of Connecticut?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, council members, Executive Director Clay. I'm Andrew Clark, and I direct the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at UConn within the School of Public Policy. And with me today are Ken Breaux, our Associate Director, and Dr. Mohammed Al-Qadri, the Director of the School of Public Policy. And it's good to see everyone today. And we're excited to share with you some findings and recommendations that we have relative to the DIA designation. As folks may know, we are the contracted third-party study group, and we do anticipate providing a full study for you. But part of this is over time, we've been interacting with various subcommittees, with the executive director and the chair, relative to where we are in the process. And so we've been asked to present today on these recommendations, and we have a PowerPoint that we'll walk through. and give you some options, essentially. We're excited because we think that there's a possible model here for Connecticut to be able to show the nation exactly what a DIA would look like relative to the war on drugs, and also importantly, how that might impact the investment or the reinvestment in those disproportionately impacted areas over time. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Mr. Brown and Dr. Alcandre.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us. I'm just going to share my screen. I think when I do that, everybody disappears on me, which is fine. So Mohammed or Andrew, if during the presentation you need to interrupt me, please do. I won't see you. Let me just, 1 second, folks. Okay, hopefully you can see the full screen now presentation. Andrew, that looks good. Okay, great. So we're here. I just want to make sure I'm on the record. This is a draft presentation. It's the process is still being tweaked, and we're sharing with you our thoughts today on the direction we think the DIA should go in, which would be included in our final report. I just want to make sure that that's clear for the transcript. So to jump right in, as you all know, DIAs, disproportionately impacted areas, are currently defined in legislation. It is defined as a census tract that has either a historical conviction rate for drug-related offenses greater than 1/10 or an unemployment rate greater than 10%. OPM, in their initial map that you certified last year, had identified 215 census tracts. That's about 26% of the statewide census tracts. Just so you understand, in our new scenarios, you can see what share is changing. It accounted for a population total of just under 800,000 people, or about 23% of the statewide population. The tracts initially identified by OPM in the map that was certified last year account for about 65% of where all historical drug-related convictions occurred, and about 56% of where all drug-related arrests occurred. We were able to analyze drug-related convictions and arrests dating back to 1983 through 2020. So you're all familiar with this map. This is your current DIA map that again was certified last year. Nothing too surprising. So based on the current law, by adding new ACS census data for 2020, right, doing the 5-year estimate that adds 2020, a total of 208 census tracts would meet the criteria. Again, last year it was 215. This year it drops to 208. Those 208 census tracts represent a quarter of all the census tracts, and they account for a population of about 757,000 people, or about 22% of the statewide population. Based on this model, the tracts account for 62% of drug-related convictions and 54% of drug-related arrests. There was a change in 67 census tracts when you added 2020 unemployment data. There were 30 tracts that were added that weren't in your previous map. They represent about 3.5% of the state population. And there were 37 tracts that no longer met the criteria from your original methodology. And that represents about 4.5% of the state population. So you added 3.5%, dropped 4.5%. That's where the difference of 1% comes. This significant change between last year's map and this year's map is largely being driven by the unemployment data. The unemployment data changed substantially as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is significantly influencing many census tracts from being added in and out. So just for comparison's sake, you can see in this map here that the bright red, these are the census tracts that are added if you stick with the current criteria. The gray, the darker gray, are the census tracts that get dropped out, and the The red that's a little bit more faded in the background are census tracts that remain unchanged regardless of the map that you certify. We understand we don't have a lot to say about the map this year. We understand that you have to certify a map soon. We understand that you're contemplating potentially only utilizing historical conviction data, maybe making some decisions around grandfathering in the old map for a period of time. And I think you'll see during the remainder of our presentation that we have many concerns about the use of unemployment data, and certainly think that it would be prudent to consider dropping the use of unemployment data moving forward. And we have recommendations we're going to walk through about a legislative change that we think you should consider to redefine how a DIA is defined in the future. So the two options we're going to talk about today, one is going to be what I'm calling our static option. It's if you wanted to make a minimal change to the definition of a DIA. And then the second is what we think is a much more sophisticated tool to use to identify disproportionately impacted areas. And we'll walk through both of those so you can just see the differences. So the first option that we're presenting to you today would be really simply replacing unemployment rate with poverty rate. Poverty is a much more stable rate to utilize. It is certainly more correlated to the historical war on drugs. And our recommendation, if you choose to go with this more sort of static map, would be to identify areas with both a 10% conviction rate or higher, or a 15% adjusted poverty rate. And we'll get into what that means. And we have a couple different options. There's also the option to look at and to use other indicators of poverty, such as participation in SNAP or the reduced lunch program as examples. And then the second option we're going to share with you, which is the one we're excited about, is replacing conviction or unemployment data with a DIA index, a proportionality index that gives more weight to certain factors such as conviction and poverty based on some policy decisions that can be made. So we're going to walk through how an index would work, how you can start to think about the use of an index, and the different data points that can be included in a DIA index. Let's start with the static measure, though. That might just be an easier place to start. And this would be simply replacing the use of the unemployment rate with the poverty rate. Over time, poverty is a more stable indicator, and it will be less influenced by short-term economic situations. Again, one of the reasons for some of the really significant changes in your current map is because unemployment data was significantly impacted by COVID. There were also 180 census tracts that have an unemployment rate that meets your threshold currently. It has an unemployment rate below 10%, but has a poverty rate greater than 10%. Forgive me. There's 180 census tracts that does not currently meet your threshold for unemployment, but they have a high rate of poverty. 63 of those 180 census tracts have a poverty rate greater than 20%, but it does not have an unemployment rate greater than 10%. The war on drugs is more closely correlated with the historic poverty than it is with the unemployment rate. And so, the question might be, what would a change look like if you went with this more sort of static measure? It would be, again, simply replacing the unemployment rate in the definition with poverty rate, and then it would be setting your threshold at either 10, 15, or 20%. Illinois currently uses a poverty rate of 20% and their threshold. Washington defines it just as a high poverty rate. It's defined elsewhere. The Illinois model uses both conviction and then they use a menu of other poverty indicators, which we'll talk about in our index score. So they use school lunch participation, the poverty rate, unemployment rate, and SNAP, all to determine their poverty rate. In Connecticut, we're recommending, if you're going to use poverty data, that you adjust the poverty rate to accommodate census tracts that are primarily colleges and universities. We have a few census tracts, for example, in stores, that is, the census tract is almost entirely the boundaries of the college campus. And obviously they would have higher poverty rates because of the income of students tends to be fairly low. So we designed a methodology to essentially remove and to properly weight areas with high rates of 18 to 24-year-olds from the poverty rate, since the 18 to 24-year-old age range is the average age of a college student. And it really only impacted the census tracts that are predominantly college towns. UConn, Fairfield University, as an example, Wesleyan in Middletown is a census tract that takes up, it's mostly just that campus, for example. When using the adjusted poverty rate, which is what we're going to just, when we talk about poverty moving forward in this presentation, we're talking about adjusting the poverty rate. 155 census tracts have an unemployment rate below 10%. So when we replace unemployment with poverty, there's 155 census tracts that would not meet your threshold based on your current definition, but they are areas with a high poverty rate. And again, 45 of these census tracts have a poverty rate greater than 20%. So there's 45 census tracts with a poverty rate greater than 20% that would not currently meet your threshold if you were to utilize unemployment information. So again, if you were to simply replace the poverty rate with unemployment rate or adjusted poverty rate, there's really three thresholds you could set it at. Right now, your unemployment rate is an unemployment rate in a tract above 10%. If you were to replace a poverty rate greater than 10%, 273 census tracts would be identified. That's about 30% of the population, 68% of the drug-related convictions, 62% of the drug-related arrests. We would ultimately recommend, if you're moving towards the use of poverty rate, that you utilize a rate greater than 15%. I think that's probably the more appropriate measure, benchmark for the use of the adjusted poverty rate. That would identify 206 census tracts, 21% of the population, 63% of drug-related convictions, and 55% of drug-related arrests. And if you dialed it all the way up, for example, to the Illinois model, a poverty rate of greater than 20%, you'd identify 172 census tracts, 17% of the population, 58% of the drug-related convictions, and half of the historical drug-related arrests. What would your map look like? This is the current map based on the addition of 2020 unemployment data. So just so you get a sense of where we start with, this is what your map would look like if you certified it using the same standard that you did last year. This is how the map would change if you replaced unemployment above 10% with adjusted poverty above 10%. I'm just going to toggling through. This is the map based on the current standard. And so you can see in the lighter red, those are the ones that are unchanged. In the darker gray, those are census tracts that no longer meet. These are tracts that are predominantly being added as a result of the 2020 unemployment rate. So you can see, for example, down in the New Canaan area, that was added because there was a strange spike in unemployment as a result of COVID. But when you use poverty, there's no historical poverty in those areas. If you were to dial up the poverty threshold to 15%, this is what we were talking about, going from, instead of using 10 as a threshold, 206 census tracts at 15%. Highlighted in red are the tracts that would remain. Then if you were to dial it up again to 20%, you could see this is the 176 or so census tracts that would remain. So you see, as you dial up the poverty rate, and you could do this for unemployment rate as well, the census tracts get more highly concentrated in our predominantly urban areas. But what we really want to spend a little more time talking about is utilizing a more weighted measure. So static measures are okay. They tell us something, but a weighted measure could have much more utility for you, particularly over time. And so this would be the use of a DIA proportionality index. So current law does not currently distinguish between a conviction rate of 10% and a conviction rate of 50% and 50%. So for example, if there's a census tract with a conviction rate of 11%, you are treating it the same as a conviction rate of 83%. And for example, in the data, there are differences that big. And the same is true for your current use of the unemployment rate. An unemployment rate of 11% is treated the same as an area that, say, has an unemployment rate of 40%. And if you were to substitute that with poverty, a static measure would have the same challenges, right? It would be no differentiating between the low end of the threshold and the high end of the threshold. Obviously, the high end of the threshold being a greater indicator of an area that was more likely impacted by the war on drugs. So we really recommend that you index each census tract to more appropriately weight factors such as poverty and drug-related convictions. The model we're going to show you today, and there's sort of several ways to build this model, and we hope to receive your feedback and your guidance, and so that we can refine this model over the coming weeks. But we're going to show you an example of this model today, which would utilize historical conviction data and the adjusted poverty rate. So we believe that conviction data, or the conviction rate, should be weighted more than other factors. The conviction rate is a more closely tied indicator of the impacts of the war on drugs, and so you might want to consider weighting that differently. An index also allows you to include other measures. So for example, in your current methodology, you're simply using the unemployment rate and conviction rate. You could build an index, which we're exploring, using the conviction rate, the poverty rate. You could use measures like census tracts with high rates of participation in SNAP, reduced lunch participation, or even incarceration rates by census tract. The index could also be used in your lottery system in a different way, so that individuals applying from DIAs with a higher index score can, for example, have an opportunity to be selected at a higher rate than somebody who is identified with a lower index score. And the same could be true for the conversations you'll have down the road about reinvestment, right? Trying to consider areas and how to utilize, build a structure to reinvest funds. It would be more appropriate to consider an index score as a way to do that. So let's go through an example of just sort of an index score. If you identify census tracts, so we sort of tried to target census tracts in this model that fall within 20% of the statewide population. It appeared as though it was a goal potentially of the SEC to try and have about 20% of the statewide population fall within a disproportionately impacted area. So for this example of utilizing a DIA index, you'd be trying to capture the census tracts that fit within about 20% of the population, or about 694,000 people. That would be about 193 census tracts met that threshold. 23% of the census tracts, it's still covering almost 2/3 of the drug-related convictions and over half of the drug-related arrests. If you were to go with this model, for example, just so you have a sense of who would be in or out, we used a DIA score from the index where we triple weighted convictions. So we created an index where every census tract gets a score, and a score essentially is adding their poverty rate to their conviction rate. But in this case, we wanted to give more weight to convictions, and so we weighted convictions 3 times. So poverty rate plus triple the conviction rate. And for your major cities in the state of Connecticut, you can see here that in this model, 29 of the 38 census tracts in Bridgeport would be identified, 6 in East Hartford, 35 tracts in Hartford, 16 in New Britain, 23 in New Haven, 5 in Norwalk, 3 in Stamford, and 19 in Waterbury. Now, if you want to see all of the tracts that would be identified in this model, 193, and you can see here, again, the areas where there's more census tracts identified, and then the areas that would fall within this metrics All right, there's ones that just maybe have one census tract, Derby, Enfield, Groton, Hamden, for example, would also meet that threshold. Now, same thing with the index score. You can dial it up to try and include a quarter of the state population. So if you were to say, well, we want to try and capture more of the state population, that would be about 866,000 people. You would go from 193 census tracts to 234 census tracts, about 28% of the census tracts. Just under 70% of the historical drug-related convictions occurred in these tracts, and 60% of the drug-related arrests. And again, here you could see if you dialed up the population, you'd add a few more tracts from Bridgeport, 2 more from East Hartford, 4 more from Hartford, 1 more from New Britain, a couple more from New Haven, Norwalk, Stamford, Waterbury. All of the tracts that would be identified in this scenario, again, you'd see some addition of a few more tracts to get you to 234 as an example. I think again, there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of the benefits of indexing and why we think you should go with indexing. And what we're really recommending is that you craft a legislative proposal to redefine a disproportionately impacted area using an indexed score. And you might want to just try and understand what are some examples of indexing. So I'm going to turn that over to Andrew. I know he's has some thoughts on sort of the benefits of indexing. So Andrew.
Sure. Thank you, Ken. And I know for members, this is probably a lot to take in. And as Ken had mentioned, there's the consideration for the immediate term. And this is more, as we see it, a longer term conversation that we're happy to dive in individually. And we hope is going to be more of a process. But the idea of indexing is not new to the state. It's not new on the federal level as well. I mean, a lot of things, the WIA or the Act in the federal, the PQOC grants, from the slots back from 1993 that currently still exist. Those are indexed. Any DOT highway safety grants, so the click it a ticket campaigns, the drive sober get pulled over, those are all indexed allocation of funds. The same is done with the Alvin Penn Act study, the racial profiling, consumer price index. The 1994 crime bill included huge investments that were all indexed. They were based on formulas, for instance, the violent crime in a particular area, the number of police you had, and things like that. So next slide, please. Connecticut is not new to indexing relative to criminal justice, and we're excited because we recently reconnected with Erica Dora and Charles Schwartz from the Justice Mapping Center. Now, Eric was part of a group back in 2003 that came along with the Council of State Justice government and pitched this idea of justice reinvestment. And frankly, it was the first time the state used evidence to look at its crime policy. And so this was right at a time that was at the pinnacle of the war on drugs, the tough on crime movement, and the state was realizing that it was disproportionately impacting people, and there was a disproportionate amount of funds that were being taken from the system and utilized for things that were not necessarily helpful to safety. So what happened was Eric came in with these national experts, and you can see here, this is one of the maps that he produced. And actually, he produced the other maps that you saw earlier today. So you'll see Hartford had a higher percentage of the number of prisoners per thousand. New Haven was next, Bridgeport, and so on. Next slide, please. We also mapped down to the actual 2 cities. We only focused on 2 cities. One was New Haven, and the other was Hartford. And here we did it based on the neighborhood tracts as well, the census. And so you could see this was a weighted score. Essentially, it showed a higher or lower percentage with prisoners in particular neighborhoods. And this was very eye-opening for people at the time who knew this intuitively, but hadn't actually seen it mapped out and so clearly done as it had been. And next, please.
That's the last of.
That's the last. So we,
Highlight
so
included.
I can send the report to folks. It also looked at SNAP and TANF and a number of other things. And what it really contemplated is, here's where we're spending a lot of money in particular neighborhoods, incarcerating people. They're on probation. They are high in SNAP and TANF use. And what if we saved resources there and reinvested in those very communities? And so that's when the Justice Reinvestment Act, the first in the nation, was passed in Connecticut. It's since been done by well over half of the states. But the reinvestment part of it was never really actualized, even though at that time we were around 20,000, 18,000 prison population. And a lot of the measures to get to the reinvestment piece of it, the justice, the getting to better public safety based on use of evidence, has resulted in half of our prison population than we did back then. But we never realized the reinvestment. So we're really excited about the idea of having these measures identify areas, in particular subject areas such as TANF and SNAP and the others, so that you can then target the reinvestment on the back end. So it's both the front end and the back end, so that you can see how you're doing over time. And you can, as you're getting that revenue, and we anticipate, year 5 will be when it really starts coming in. You can utilize these maps for those activities. So, Ken, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think this is just an illustration of how, right, even just looking at this one neighborhood, if you were to draw, just sort of use a static measure, anything that not in yellow, for example, you might be treating equally. But from the map, you can tell that the darker the color gets, those are areas that are significantly more impacted by incarceration, for example. And you might want to be trying to target reinvestment dollars, or even providing additional weight even on the front end in the lottery system, not based on this map, but based on this concept, right? Same would be true for indexing statewide, or as the census tracts, right? The areas in this map that have a darker color are obviously impacted more, and you might want to be, we just think an index gives you much more utility as you're making decisions, and decisions are evolving over time. So last slide, just to reiterate, we're really, again, presenting 2 options. At the very minimum, we think you need to be moving away from the use of the unemployment rate. And if you're going to stick with a static measure, you should be utilizing poverty, or adjusted poverty in particular. We would recommend that the poverty level be at 15%, but you can certainly dial it up or down. But really, the measure we're trying to highlight today that we think will be much more beneficial to this work over time is the use of a DIA index, providing more weight to certain factors such as conviction, poverty, et cetera. You don't have to be stuck, again, with just 2 measures. You can utilize 10 measures in the development of your index score. We've personally internally identified probably 4 or 5 that we would likely use, including convictions, adjusted poverty, incarceration rates, participation in SNAP, reduced school lunch programs, et cetera. And it ensures that you are more appropriately weighting areas that have been impacted by the war on drugs more so than other areas. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to ask Dr. Al-Qadri if he has anything he wants to add. I know he did a lot of work on this, and then I'm sure we can open it up to questions.
Okay.
Mohammed, you're on mute.
I am on mute. A couple of things. So if we end up using an index in the selection process in the lottery system, you would not be wiping out people from lower index areas. You would just be giving a chance of being selected that is proportional to how the DIA was impacted. So if somebody's coming from a high impact DIA, they would have a higher chance of being selected, but that would not eliminate the opportunity for others to be selected if they're coming from DIAs with lower scores. So essentially, it's like if somebody's coming from double the score, they would get double the chance of being selected. It's like they applied twice, essentially, instead of applied once. And then the other one is on poverty. It would be really good if you all are making a legislative proposal to leave that as a poverty measure that is up to the council based on what's out there. So if we can get SNAP data, we can geocode that and use it. That's the cleanest way to do this, because census data is based on estimates from the ACS, the American Community Survey, and a SNAP data point will be a lot more appropriate, I think, and would be accessible. We'd have that data in the state. But that's all. Thank you, everyone. It's good to see everyone here.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. I'm sure I had the benefit of getting a snapshot of it yesterday, and so I just had a couple of I guess observations that it seems that this is a more flexible application than what currently exists. And the question I have is, could you give us, I think it might be helpful if we got an example of applying a weighted average to a couple of existing DIAs.
I think, for example, right, we know there was a census tract I remember looking at in Ansonia that had a conviction rate of 11% and a poverty rate of, say, 12 to 15%. It was really sort of on the margins. And we know that there's a census tract, for example, in Hartford. Actually, one of them gets a DIA score of 500%. Now, that's an outlier. It has a very high conviction rate in that census tract, and it has a very high poverty rate in that census tract. The index score allows you to make decisions that doesn't treat them the same. Now, let's say you have in the future, you're having discussions about how to reinvest $20 million. It might be less appropriate to divide the $20 million evenly between the census tracts, and it might be more appropriate to weight them. The census tract that had a score of 500, because it had such a high conviction rate over time, might need more dollars reinvested in it than a census tract that was always sort of on the border, but now all of a sudden gets treated equally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and but in terms of the actual process of weighting, how would that, I would imagine you have to start with some unit of measure, I guess. So
I think, yeah.
How would that work in terms of selecting units of assigning, say, 1 unit equals something, right? And
Yeah.
And as you say, Ansonia has a weighted unit of 1, where Hartford might have a weighted unit, at least that census tract might have a weighted unit of 7. I'm just trying to get at how we.
So we take the percent, like the rate, the conviction rate per census tract. That's one of the items that currently contributes to that weighted index map that Ken showed you, or the tables that Ken showed you. So conviction rate is, we take the number of convicted people divided by the population. That gives you the conviction rate. And that is one component, right, of that index. The second component of that index, we use adjusted poverty rate because we don't have SNAP data and we don't have reduced lunch data. But the poverty measure that we don't think unemployment is a good measure of poverty. So we use the adjusted poverty rate. That is the number of people who are living in poverty in a census tract minus those who are living in poverty who are 18 to 24 in age, to remove the college folks. And that gives us the second component. So multiply the conviction rate that we created 3 times, multiply it by 3, and add it to the adjusted poverty rate, which is the number of people living in poverty per population, and then you have a final score for that census tract. Is that,
Also-
is that your question?
Yeah,
I think you also have to know that
yes.
what you're talking about is making, at the end of the day, you're gonna have to make some policy decisions. We can guide you as researchers to say, we believe these are the measures and indicators that we think should be included in an index. We think conviction should be included, some indicator for poverty. You likely should include some indicator for historical incarceration rates, for example. But ultimately, if this is the direction the council wants to move in, we would spend some time working with you to refine what's included in the index. But I think in the short term, the recommendation to the legislature would be trying to craft legislative language that gives you the ability to develop an index based on certain measures without having your hands tied to a 10% conviction rate or a 10% unemployment rate. And so right now, it's just a matter of saying, look at how the tool can be used, and it probably over the next few months, we would work with you to refine what's in and what's out of the measure.
Right, and I think that's what I was. That's a clearer way of presenting what I was trying to ask, which is at some point, I think if the policy committee is to recommend this to the council, then the question is, okay, we see that this is greater flexibility and is a more robust way of applying of both giving opportunities and at the same time, and also as we discussed yesterday, perhaps using another weighted measure for reinvestment. But I think the question is, so how would we go about it? And what you're saying is that's really step two, and it's a rather rigorous process, it sounds like, in developing what the scale will be on which various census tracts will be weighted.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, if I may too, there is precedent for this in legislation. We staff administer the Alvin Penn Act, the Racial Profiling Act, and that law was originally a very static kind of definition of how data was supposed to be collected and reported. And when we made revisions to it, which actually we're celebrating the 10th year of it tonight, we essentially codified that it was a methodology that was going to be developed and a method that was going to be done with the Racial Profiling Advisory Board along with OPM. And so it allowed for flexibility, and this was a process that took months to come up with the initial methodology, which we've continued to refine over time based on understandings through science and the people being impacted and the like. So there is precedent for it.
Okay, I think, and I would love to hear what my fellow committee members think. I think what we need to do is, if we're going to recommend this to the full council, is to show them not only is this more flexible and more robust way of doing it, but also just how we are going to go about implementing. That's what I'm trying to get at, so that we can see that yes, this is a better way, and this is how we're going to arrive at the weighted scores, if in fact this is what we're recommending. But I'd like to hear what other committee members have to say.
Well,
I was just going to say, Chairman Shirley, you have a few hands up. I think all of your committee members have their hands up.
I have their hands up. All right. Councilman Jefferson, you would begin.
yeah, good morning. And I want to thank Andrew and Ken and Mohammed. Yeah, excellent presentation. I mean, this was just phenomenal. And the work you did on this is just wonderful, because it allows us to present evidence. And, the goal is to address, what happened, what occurred in communities that were decimated by the war on drugs. And the maps clearly indicate which communities were impacted the most. And I always loved the Illinois model because it took poverty into consideration. And I was always wondering why we didn't use that model originally to develop our DIAs. I love the 20% threshold. If we can do better, I would, because I think we need to concentrate and focus on the truly disproportionately impacted areas. My question, and indexing is perfect. I mean, the NBA uses a certain lottery system that allows the worst team. They give them 6 or 7 balls, for the worst team to get the #1 draft pick, right? So it's not unusual, and I think it's quite fair to do it that way. And to even, once you look into a particular area, like take New Haven, and you can go down New Haven and say, okay, Newhallville is here, the Hill is here. I just think it's fair. That is just the fairest way to do it. I would adopt it in a second. I just want to know, are you aware of any best practices based on the model we discussed today and indexing that has been discussed? Are you aware of any practice in any of the states that have adopted adult use cannabis, the industry itself?
I can just tell you that there hasn't, and Andrew can add to, in my opinion, there hasn't been a state that has done this that well. It's very early. And so, I actually think that this is a model that other states could look to down the road, because everybody is thinking about this in such a static way, and they're not thinking about it in sort of a more appropriate weighted way. Andrew?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think there are some states that are probably, like you pointed out, with Illinois ahead of us currently, but I think this would put Connecticut really in the forefront of the thinking, especially when it's contemplating the reinvestment part of it. So you could tie these indicators to say, hey, we now are reinvesting in areas that we have indicators on. So then we can see over time whether or not those investments are actually creating equity and lifting people out of poverty, per se.
So, Councilwoman Gordon, is that your hand up?
Yes. Yeah. So thank you again. I think this was really, really good. I think it helps to present the issue in a way that it actually feels like we're solving the problem based on the problem. I echo Councilman Jefferson's comments that I would really want to figure out how we do this moving forward. But I guess I have a question about, so there's a lot of data on like how algorithms work and like the biases that exist in algorithms. And I want to make sure that whatever we do moving forward, like however we do that algorithm or whatever it is that we're doing, it's rooted in a space of equity. So I guess my question is, if we were to move this forward, and I care about this a lot from the reinvestment dollars perspective, and I like the weights where it's like, if there are certain census tracts so I think I'm a little more liberal and I want as many people to have access to this as possible, but I think some of my other council members, which I think is fine, if there's a demonstrated need in a community and it's at a 1, like we could figure out, X percentage of dollars should be invested in that community. If they're at a 1, I'd rather see some reinvestment than no reinvestment if there's a demonstrated need. But I guess I wonder, would it be a computer program that's figuring out these different things, or would it be like human beings that's looking at the impact and say, there's a score of 3 versus a score of 1 versus a score of 7, and how are we determining how those resources are spent? I guess that's just, I think I'm just trying to figure out practically how it works. And bias is real in computer programming and bias is real in humans, and who has the last say in what happens here? I guess those are just some of my questions.
I could talk some about that. So I know, and I'm familiar with it on the criminal justice side, and you know, a lot of it is that's come out in terms of that, and the criticisms are on, let's say, risk assessment. So determining risk for purposes of sentencing, for purposes of incarceration, and for purposes of folks going out on probation or parole. And a lot of those assessments had used things that essentially were proxies for being in particular neighborhoods. So, you know, if you're more likely to get arrested, or you're more likely to not have a college degree or something like that. And so it essentially weighted disproportionately folks and people of color in particular that kept them out of the opportunity for essentially being on parole, or created a greater likelihood for a greater sentence, or being incarcerated versus being out on probation. I think this isn't necessarily an algorithm here, but what the replacement of, say, for instance, unemployment with poverty is doing exactly that. So as Dr. Al-Qadri knows better than the rest of us on the team, how unemployment doesn't really reflect the war on drugs as much as, say, poverty does. And that's why we'd love to work with you all to really hone it in terms of how it would best reflect per your view, and, you know, with the review of the literature and from hearing from people from directly impacted areas, what are those indicators that we can utilize for this?
I mean, you're never going to find a, you know, the end of the day, you can take 100 different methodologies and present them to 100 different researchers, and they'll all point something out that they do and don't like about the methodology. So, you know, what you're trying to do is you're trying to not allow the perfect be the enemy of the good. And, you know, it's a matter of building a methodology that the group can feel comfortable with, and then saying, okay, now that we think that these are the appropriate and fair indicators to apply in the methodology. And again, we think this one's, you know, your conviction data is, probably important to look at. Same is true with indicators for poverty, indicators for historical incarceration, et cetera. But we would work to refine the methodology, and then running the methodology is usually easier than making those policy decisions about how you refine it.
I see two other hands, Councilman Walton and Councilwoman Naeem.
Hi, okay, good morning, and I reiterate, it was a great presentation, and I'm glad that I read it beforehand, so I was able to keep up a little bit. And to Councilman Jefferson's point, you know, the Knicks are always getting multiple balls, and they still can't get the #1 pick. So, you know, I don't know what's going. You know, I hope this is a little different than that. But I guess my question, and I do agree with using poverty and drug-related conviction. And I look at things like today, there was an article in the paper where, you know, this is the second time someone's trying to propose another drug treatment center in the middle of New Haven, right? And so the war on drugs and poverty continues. My question is on some clarity in terms of did I hear you correctly when you say you recommend giving more weight to drug-related convictions? And I guess would be, why is that versus poverty? Because I would say in terms of that war on drugs, and I, you know, can't give you a number of who was convicted, but a lot of those folks that were convicted are drug, you know, users, right? Not necessarily this idea of it being a drug kingpin. So I think, why would we do more drug-related convictions instead of poverty? And would the numbers be skewed if you weighed more with poverty?
You know, it's a very good question, and I think that's why, you know, these are just placeholders for you to consider and would be refined over time. You in working with criminal justice data over the year, we know that a conviction doesn't necessarily lead to the same thing for different individuals. So someone who may have been convicted on a lower level crime may get probation versus incarceration, especially if there's more than one charge on there. And so an incarceration rate is also more, being incarcerated is also more disruptive to individuals, families, and communities, and is more concentrated in particular tracks, arguably the ones most impacted by the war on drugs. So that might be a better indicator. We just essentially put some things out there for you to consider, but I think this is a good example of why that conversation is important.
The conviction rate also, the data on convictions is a little bit better because it's full. It's not an estimate, it's a real count, versus the data on poverty is currently utilizing ACS estimates, and 2020 was a crazy year for the census. And so, in terms of and in the model we developed for you today to sort of understand the concept, frankly, we didn't want to overwhelm people by deviating too much from the standards that you had already been using in your previous map. So I think your point is taken, but again, that's where the policy decisions are going to have to come. If there's a decision made that conviction data is important, at the end of the day, somebody has to weigh in on the policy end in terms of, well, how much weight should that be given? Should it be given a straight up weight? Should poverty be counted more? Should SNAP be counted more? But those are the discussions we'd have to have.
Councilwoman Naeem, did you have your hand up?
My questions were addressed, so I'll yield to, I think, Councilman Gordon.
Okay.
Sorry, my hand was just, I forgot to lower my hand. And my dog.
Councilman Walton, did you had another question?
I did, and I thank you. And so I think the other thing, because I know you talked about getting poverty, right? We talked about SNAP and things of that nature. I think another thing for us, and maybe this is for the council to consider, is how they're, when we're looking at data from school districts, right? And what immediately comes to mind are the 11 alliance districts, right? Who typically, again, impact the same impacted areas that you're going to see in those maps. So that's probably, I imagine that's probably something more for the policy committee and the committee to consider. But I just think also education can give us some guidance as well.
And so today, though, thank you, Councilman Walton. I think today what I hear is being presented is this is the concept, and how we're going to actually populate that concept is to be decided. It sounds like Chairwoman Comer, I guess you will make some decision as to recommending how that will take place.
I would recommend that in the short term, in order to move in this direction, right? What's the immediate need versus where do we have more time? The immediate need is in crafting a definition to present to the legislature to redefine a DIA, and to do it in such a way that gives you enough leeway to make methodological decisions, in the coming days and weeks, and to refine the methodology over time. In 5 years from now, there might be a refinement that you want to make. So I think the immediate term is, how do we define a DIA to allow you to move in this direction? And then frankly, you have some time. I mean, you don't have to certify another map until next year. And then there's talk about maybe certifying it for a longer period of time. So that's the map you want to make sure is done right. So yeah, we have some time to really refine the actual methodology. You probably have less time to craft legislation around a definition that allows you to move in this direction.
Okay, thank you for that. Comments from Madam Chair and/or Executive Director Clay?
I just noticed that Madam Chairwoman is not on the call at this time, but we have been working with UConn over the last couple of weeks, and we understand what we need to do. So our plan is to ask the policy committee to make a recommendation, and I believe it's to use conviction rates for the map for this year. We will also, because we have to do, and we're going to have a discussion on legislative recommendations, we will ask and insert a placeholder, and that will give the policy committee a little bit more time to talk about the legislative recommendations to go forward and to change the criteria that we are measuring the DIAs to include poverty, adjusted poverty, and other measures that the committee will recommend.
Okay.
I see Councilwoman Gordon's hand is up.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Shirley. Mhm.
I have to hop off because I have another call. So I just want to get a little bit of clarity. Are we making the recommendation today, or are we going to have a discussion? Because I don't know if it was necessarily I think there were a few options that we had. And in full transparency, I think it would be good to like go back after having this conversation and asking the questions to decide on which one that we end up making. So I'm just to put it out there, I don't think I'm 100% comfortable making the decision today, because I think this was a really good presentation, but I want to go back and review what was sent out to us before we make a decision. And I also was thinking that based on the fact that where we are with the current like DIA map, I want to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're not hindering the process of the folks who are currently under review, who already been approved, or who have not been approved and we're in litigation with. So I just want to make sure that like whatever we're doing moving forward, we're being very clear that it doesn't supersede the map that currently exists. And I think, I don't know where I'd make this recommendation. I think based on what's happening with licenses, I'd like to hold the current map and like have that be the precedent for the next year while we figure this stuff out and then make the right decision. So I just want to make sure that we're not voting to make any changes today, because I don't.
Right. I had not, well, what is our next, we weren't voting today, I don't think. I take your point, Councilwoman Gordon. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot to digest, and I'm not sure we're prepared to do that today. But what's the time constraint?
So just to and Ken or one of you guys can help me if I don't get this right, or Christina, you can help me if I don't get this right. It is my understanding that we are required to recertify the map. Whether we like it or not, we still have to. That's our legislative responsibility, is to recertify. The question is, do we recertify using the same criteria that was used before, or do we use just the conviction rate to recertify the map for this year? The map that currently exists will not affect municipalities or applicants. So it is when at the time that you apply, the map at the time that you applied. So everyone who applied, who is in the process, who has been approved as a social equity applicant, all the municipalities who have DIAs that could disappear later on, they will remain the same. So those folks will not be affected, neither will the municipalities. We will do a placeholder for legislation for this year, because we have to have our legislative recommendations in by October 3rd. So we don't have enough time to have another discussion. And then we will have a discussion immediately after this on what we want the measures to look like when we are recertifying the map in 2024. And then in 2024, that map could be the map for an extended period of time. You could vote that it is for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 2 years.
So, Janira, quick question. So we are required by statute to recertify, correct?
Correct.
So I know that we could ask somebody, I'm not sure who the somebody is, to continue to keep the map the way that it is, despite the fact, can't we or make a request, because I just want to make sure that we're being 100%, like we're saying that it's going to stay the same, right? I think something needs to exist somewhere, whether it's a formal memo, whether it's something somewhere, because I don't think based on like, we are not in a position, or I'm not in a position today to make a decision on any new recertification of anything. So is it a formal memo? Is it, and like, how do we do, I guess is what I'm trying to figure out, or you don't have to answer the question today. Like somebody can come back to us and tell us how to do that. So we're not making decisions that we're not, or I just feel like I don't have all the information to make that decision, because now what is the conviction rate map that we'd be voting on today or tomorrow? I'm not sure what that would be. So I do know we need more time.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that, but if I just want to get clear, what in terms of option 2 that you presented, which is the one that you prefer, that is a refinement of the existing methodology. Would that be a correct statement? And that it actually, and if we were to apply that today, it wouldn't change DIAs, would it? I mean,
you couldn't apply that. You know, just so that we're clear, you know, the use of, say, an index would require a legislative change. The law is pretty, it doesn't give you a lot of room to move. It says unemployment rate and it says conviction rate greater than 10%. So when it comes to recertifying a map this year, you don't have a lot of options. Now, we do think if you're going to recertify a map this year, you know, you should drop the unemployment rate. It's not a good measure. And it was significantly impacted by the 2020 COVID pandemic. So, you know, if you're feeling as though, just our sort of opinion, if you're feeling as though you have to recertify a map this year, because the legislation requires you to recertify one every year, if you were to recertify a map that only used conviction rate, you wouldn't be adding any new census tracts. You would essentially be removing census tracts that didn't meet the conviction standard, but did meet the unemployment standard. Now, if you're able to grandfather in the old map, which is, I think, what Ginny Ray is talking about, you're grandfathering it in at the time of application, meaning you were utilizing that map at the time of application. That's the map that will apply. You're passing a new map this year that only uses the conviction rate. You drop out unemployment, and then you're working with the legislature to try and change the definition of a DIA so that you can move more towards the model we've presented.
And that is what,
option 2, right?
Yeah, and now that's up to you, but we're obviously, I think, a little bit stronger on our recommendation for option 2 as opposed to option 1.
Mr. Chair, I agree with Ken. The evidence is so clear. We got this thing wrong. The DIAs are wrong. That's just the bottom line. If we're talking about reinvesting community dollars, I am very uncomfortable having New Canaan in the mix. I'm just uncomfortable with that. You know, when you look at what these gentlemen have done and have provided to us, and you break down New Haven, you break down Hartford, and you look at the individual census tracts, it's just clear. I'm a criminal defense attorney. Evidence drives that process. This is the evidence. This is what we've been longing for, is the evidence to create the DIAs. These gentlemen have presented the evidence. We're mandated by statute to address this. We have to address it. We just can't go along and say, keep things as is. We can't do it. We have to recertify. And here's the other thing. We have the time. If we don't get it right this time, we can get it right, but we're moving in the right direction. We cannot stand on a treadmill. That's the problem. And we don't have a choice. We have to recertify, and we have to use factors that some of us may not be comfortable with, but makes all the sense in the world because it gets us to the point that we're talking about. When you look at New Haven and you saw the individual tracks, and the darker the track was, that's I live in New Haven. I clearly know that's where the war on drug had the harshest impact on those communities.
Right, and so that's clear. I mean, it was clear that that's the most. I'm calling it robust, but you know, it's the one with the most subtleties and the most differentiation. So that's the one that UConn prefers. It's the one that I'm hearing the policy committee would prefer if they could if it could be applied. So the question now becomes, what can we do to move in that direction, given the existing legislation?
If
And
I
I
may,
think,
Just to provide clarity on my question and what I was saying, I just want to make sure we're getting the grandfathering part in correctly, because I think I agree 100% that what was presented is what we need to do. I just want to make sure that whatever we're doing is creating clarity on the folks who are already out there right now that are so I think that's just what I want to be clear on. My issue is not on changing, because I 100% agree with everyone that we need to change the map. All I want to do is, do we have in writing somewhere a memo, something that is clear about the grandfathering process based on the applications? And that's the only thing that I think I'm questioning right now at the moment, to make sure that like we're clear on what we're doing there, and not based on the fact that we're voting now and people are still within the process. So that's the only thing I want to provide clarity on before we make a decision.
So through you, Mr. Chair, we have done research, and recertifying the map does not affect those folks who have already made application. It does not affect those folks who are negotiating in the current DIAs. The fact that the council would like to make sure that that map remains in effect for this particular lottery is a policy decision. So you could vote to say that the current, I think that using the word grandfather is not the right term, because that map does not affect anybody going forward. It is only those folks who are participating in this particular lottery and this particular application period. When the council begins, or DCP opens another lottery, this map for this year will be the map for those people. And then once you recertify the map in 2024, this current map, you could vote to say it still is in place for those people who applied during the second lottery, negotiated in those DIAs. And then in 2025, the new map would take effect, or the 2024 map would take effect for however many years, if you decide that you do not want to recertify every year. And again, through legislation, we would be making those recommendations this year.
so, and I got confused somewhere in the middle of that.
Sorry.
But so the existing applications and the existing lottery winners will not be affected.
It will not be affected.
So, okay.
When the policy committee recommends to the full council that the current map remain in place for this lottery, not future lotteries, for this particular lottery, everyone participating right now is safe to continue to negotiate and work in this space with this map.
Would the application of what was presented today change? Would it change the map to a point that there are DIAs that would go away?
Absolutely.
Quite possibly, yes.
It would. Okay. All right. So then, are we constrained then to keep the existing map because the lottery process has begun? That's my question.
The lottery process has begun, which means no one else, and the application period has closed. No one else can participate using this map. So everyone who is participating currently is safe to continue. Any new lottery, once this map is recertified, any new lottery will be affected by the newly certified map. And that also, I believe, will include any EJVs that apply after the map is certified. They don't get to, because they did not apply during this period. So once we recertify this map, any DIAs, EJVs that are formed are constrained to the newly recertified map. So people are not entitled to this map right here.
So are there applications now, EJV applications, that would drop out if we recertify using this more robust system?
We have not recertified the map. So until you recertify, anybody who has an application in, and you can also say that the recertified map will take effect December 1st. Or next year, you can say the recertified map, it's recertified in August, it will take effect October 1st, or whatever you want, to allow people to finish up, to get their applications in if this particular map works for them.
So we can say that we, using a new methodology, we would like to use a new methodology to recertify the DIAs, such recertification to take place at some point in time when the existing applicants, et cetera, are not affected.
You would say that at your you could recommend that at your September 26th special meeting, that the council use the map that is recertified using only conviction rates. I think that is the recommendation, because it is conviction rates or unemployment rate. And so I think UConn is saying it's best to use the conviction rate, whatever that map comes out to be. It is what it is. We put a placeholder, or we propose legislation to change the criteria to exclude unemployment and add adjusted poverty and conviction rates as a method, or I don't know, one or the other or both, as a method for recertifying the map in 2024.
Madam Executive Director, and if possible, add the language that would allow us to index
yes,
right,
as well, right? So
yes.
we're doing poverty, we're eliminating unemployment, we're adding conviction rate, poverty, adjusted poverty, and language that would address indexing.
Yes.
That would allow us to index the new DIAs.
Yes.
The tracks in the DIAs, the DIAs, right, and the tracks within the DIAs.
Right.
Yes.
If I may here just for a second, so it's really important. Somebody mentioned the Illinois example, and Illinois leaves it up to the council, I believe, to choose between poverty rate, unemployment rate, SNAP, or reduced lunch programs. And it would be really good to get to something like this. I just want to be clear on something here. Unemployment rate and poverty rate, both of them at the census tract levels, are estimates. They are not actual numbers. They are estimates based on a survey of a sample within that census tract. So that data is not actual data as available at the census tract. They survey a number of people within that census tract, usually, not a lot, because by census tracts are not huge. And then they extrapolate to the entire census tract based on that survey. So I just want to be clear that you all, as members of the policy committee, understand that census data at the census tract level for unemployment and for poverty rate are both estimates, are not actual data.
And your legislative recommendation might use a term like, to identify high poverty areas as defined by the SEC, for example. What that allows you to do is to know that you have to use a poverty indicator, but you can then make the policy choice, well, the ACS data is good, or the SNAP data is good, or so, to the degree to which that is palatable to the legislature, that you might want to be considering, and again, we're happy to help think through some of this, considering language that ensures that certain measures are used, but you have the flexibility to refine those measures over time.
Yeah, you know, as we think about it, and I hate to add this additional variable, but getting rid of unemployment, so I think there is a positive correlation between race and unemployment, particularly in areas of high poverty. So I'm just wondering, if we get rid of unemployment, are we losing something?
I think
Now you add poverty and conviction rate, because clearly, if you add it, you get rid of the some of the tracks that shouldn't be considered anyway. The reason why the unemployment skews the data.
so.
It gives us tracks that we really
We
don't
really need.
we don't
And-
need. So
and
you
unemployment-
have to make a choice.
And unemployment never captures chronic unemployment. So if somebody is unemployed for a long period of time, they drop out of the labor force. They're no longer in the labor force. So they're not even captured in the unemployment data. They're counted as they're just not in the labor force,
They're
which
not
does
counted.
not go toward calculating the unemployment data. And you have, if anything, poor communities have chronic unemployment that lasts not 6 months or 2 or 3 months. They last years.
Forever, right. Okay, so that explains in the why I think that's a good explanation for why unemployment or losing unemployment would not be would not be a loss, an absolute loss to what we're doing. So in the recertification, we want to include poverty, we want to include conviction rate, and we want to include some form of indexing.
Yes, and you know, in the map that you have to recertify, say tomorrow, your only option is to either do conviction and unemployment or drop out unemployment and use conviction. In the redefining a DIA in legislation this year, you're on track, right? It's the convictions, it's some indicator for poverty, it's being able to index the data, but we also might want to consider either spending a little bit more time in the coming weeks, figuring out if there's other measures that should be included in that definition, or writing in a catch-all language such as and other factors deemed appropriate by the SEC. Because you might determine, for example, incarceration data is important to include in there. You might determine some other factor we haven't thought of yet should be included in there. So not sure how palatable that would be to have it sort of open-ended, but certainly that's how I would be thinking about crafting legislation.
Through you, Mr. Chair, can I just make a suggestion that we agree, that we take a vote today that we are going to use conviction data to recertify the map for this year. We are legally obligated, led by legislation, to recertify the map. So our two options, as Ken has said, is either unemployment or conviction. We don't have to use both, so that we do.
Poverty?
What about what?
Can we
Poverty
add
is not an option. We can't add it. We have to add that legislatively. So if we get past recertifying the map for this year with conviction data only, we put a placeholder in for legislation to add poverty, to add all of the other things we're discussing today. And then the policy committee has more time to discuss this in greater detail for the legislative session and the recertification of the map for 2024. So today we have to get past and we have to get to recertifying the map. And then you can say that this recertified map won't take effect until December 1st, or, it can't be like a long time, but I think it can be to give people an opportunity to adjust. But currently we don't have a lottery open, so no one is applying just yet. So you could actually make this map, this recertified map, effective upon voting. And that way everybody knows, get yourself together, because a new lottery is going to come, and this is the map that is going to we're going to be using. Again, those folks who are currently under review, who have already applied, they are going to be for, again, lack of a better word, because it's not really grandfathered, but they're going to be able to be measured under this map. Because you say it's not forever. It's only until.
So what is the difference though between dropping out a new methodology that would drop out unemployment and use only conviction rates, and a map that would use conviction rate plus poverty in some indexing form?
You only have two options for this recertification: unemployment and conviction. That's in the legislation. Now, next year, or in this, as we have further discussions in the weeks to come, we will ask for and discuss poverty and whatever other measures the council would like to add to the legislation. But right now, poverty is not a part of the option that we have for recertifying the map in the legislation.
So
go ahead.
If I could just kind of rephrase the process. Step one is we have two options and we must recertify and have something. Step two is based on the presentation today, and I think we're going to need to go back and digest some of this. We need to make some recommendations to the legislature to say we would like to think about DIAs based on these additional factors, not just the two that are written in, right? So then step three is, we advocate for that. They approve it, hopefully. Step four is we come back next year and recertify a new map that then brings in poverty data as well, or whatever else we decide we need to. So it is going to take longer, but I think like everyone was saying, this is a good step in the right direction. But because there are legislative hurdles, it will need to take a little bit more time than we can probably get through. The one question I have is, what will we do? And should we just chat with our staff attorney and just make sure we have a good understanding on this? I understand that the lottery is now closed, so everyone that wanted to get in with this map has gotten in. But what if we have applicants that say, you know what, I wasn't ready for this lottery, but your new map cuts me out entirely for the next one, and I've put in all this work and time and energy because this is what you've been advertising for the last year. How are we going to handle that situation?
No one is entitled to, because you didn't apply yet. I wasn't ready. It's a new lottery and a new, go ahead.
I understand. I just think that is something we need to be ready to have a some sort of public statement ready for, because you might get that. And it's fair. I think people take time to figure out when it comes to these types of businesses.
Time and money.
Yes. Okay. We will have our staff attorney research and get back to the committee.
So for today, what do we need? We need to vote on, what do we need to vote on? The removal of unemployment as a variable in the certification process?
No, you need to vote on using conviction rates only. Unemployment is right now is a part of the legislation, so you can't remove it, but you can choose not to use it. So you can just do conviction rates, recertify the map using only conviction rates.
Could you just bring up the map? I'm sorry, I don't have the presentation in front of me, but if we could just see the comparison between the conviction rates only versus the unemployment. I think you had a good kind of layover.
I don't believe we have that map. We showed you the difference with poverty.
You only show the poverty one. Okay.
So we can get you, Ojala, we can get you a map of those two. And so if the comparison, we have them, but we didn't have them for today because we were hearing the presentation. So I can get that out to you.
Vote on it without seeing the map.
Okay, and we have it's from another source, and I want to make sure we have the most recent. So if you want, we can get that out to you. And if you guys would like to reconvene in the special meeting before September 26th, just to look at the map, we're happy to, or vote on it. And we're happy
I have
to
a
get
map.
that to you.
I have a map if you want to look at it. I would go with the map they're going to send you, but I do have a map of just the census tracts that were identified as guilty over 10%. So or convicted over 10%.
I think it'd be helpful just to see the current map and then what it would be if we were to go to conviction only and just be able to compare the two.
We
I
can
think
get
we
that.
have one that removes them, right, Ken? In the PowerPoint.
No, it included, Mohammed, the poverty rate. We had done it with unemployment and poverty data. But essentially, you know, you would be certifying a map that of all the census tracts that have a conviction rate dating back to 1983 of greater than 10%, and it's mostly going to be your major cities. It's basically Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury. You know, they are all tracts that are currently in your map. So you're not adding any new tracts, but you would be removing tracts that do not have a high conviction rate, but had a higher unemployment rate. As we discussed, the unemployment data, you know, we feel comfortable, at least as a bridge, dropping out unemployment.
And the unemployment rate that we're currently using is greater than 10%.
Yes.
And so I think what I'm hearing is that for this certification, we cannot increase that. It has to stay that because that's where it is, right? We can't, that's in the legislation.
Yeah. That's my understanding. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, you're right.
So that's okay.
And like we said, in 2020, there were some census, take the New Canaan example, that because of COVID, they saw a short-term spike in unemployment in that one fairly wealthy census tract that isn't impacted by historical poverty. And frankly, when new data comes out next year, that will disappear likely. So that's the problem with using unemployment data, particularly in the wake of COVID.
Right. And that's been clarified. That's a good point. Yeah, COVID did affect that.
So
are experts? I'm sorry, Councilwoman Naeem, you was about to say something.
No, I was going to ask if we are then looking to vote today, or if we're going to do a special session. I unfortunately do have a hard 11:30. I'm already running over.
Yeah.
I'm happy.
I don't understand why. I think you laid out the process, Councilwoman Naeem, perfectly. We're gonna have to get to this point anyway. I think this is a necessary first step. I would make the motion to recommend that we use the conviction data and not the unemployment data for the recertification of this map. Let's just move that to. We have too many special meetings coming up. We have another one coming up. It's just let's just make that. I want to make that motion to move that recommendation to the full council for the next meeting. It's just a logical next step.
Yep. I would be comfortable with that because we're not approving it, right? The council certifies it. So as long as between now and then the council meeting, you guys can get us those maps, just so if there are any red flags, we're aware of them. I'm okay with that.
Can we get a second?
Second.
Any more questions on that? If not, then all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. And so I would ask Director Clay if you can have Attorney Matravy create some language that specifies what we just moved, so that we're clear on that, at least that I'm clear on that.
Yeah, I will have Christina, our legislative liaison, create the language.
Okay.
And information. Great. Okay.
Great.
And we'll get you those maps, right? I've actually already sent a message asking for them. So I do suspect to get them shortly, and you will have them. I can also offer, if anyone member of the committee would like to have office hours to ask any other questions that you might have or see any additional data prior to your vote, I can offer that to you with our UConn team.
And that's prior to the council vote?
Yes, prior to the vote and right after today's meeting.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. That was great, worth waiting for. And I think, as Councilman Jefferson said, a move in the right direction.
Yes, thank you.
For the good of the order.
So, sorry, Chairman Shirley, we do have the legislative recommendations. That there should be a discussion that everyone has seen them. And
oh yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, you're right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you would like Christina Diamond to join in to provide any guidance, she can.
All right. Are there any discussions? Have we had a chance to take a look at that? Executive Director Clay, can you put those up on the screen? I think there were maybe 4 or 5.
Yeah, I'm going to let Christina take it from here. I don't know if she has that document ready, but we did send it to members. Go ahead, Christina.
Don't have it right in front of me. Hold on a minute.
Councilman Jefferson, did you have a question? I just noticed your hand is up. Did you?
My question was addressed. I apologize. Let me get
Thank you.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes. Let's see.
Okay, so this chart was prepared based on feedback from council members. And basically, there's 2 major concepts that the council has wanted to discuss. And that was the issues around the definition of DIA, which we talked about this morning, and then clarifying the definition of ownership and control. Right. And so, you know, the first one here, we can decide if we want to recertify the map, if we want to make that recommendation to, instead of having an annual recertification, that we change that requirement either to every 5 years, every 7 years, every 10 years. And again, that doesn't affect this year. But this would go into effect after the legislative session, should it pass, and be in effect for next time we recertify the map.
Through you,
right.
I don't think we should tinker with, I think we have to change the definition, obviously, and add poverty, add indexes, and add conviction rates, whatever we have to do to reflect what we heard today from our experts. Now, as far as the recertification process go, I think until we know we got it right and we're comfortable with it, we should look at it on an annual basis. I'm in favor of moving towards every 3 years, every 5 years even, but not until we get it right. Because if we screw it up, then we can't fix it until another 5 years, or another 3 years. So that's my position on the legislative recommendation pertaining to the DIAs.
Good point. And as we have I had an echo? Hold on a second. That's is that better? No, it's not.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that for this year, I think we're gonna keep it as is and not submit a recommendation to change it annually at this for next legislative session.
No, we want to change. We want to change how we acknowledge a DIA, how we create the DIA, because based on discussion, but we don't want to change that particular aspect of the legislation about how long it takes to recertify.
Right. Yep. That's what I was referring to. Yes. So
you may want to consider, Councilman Jefferson, certifying a map that for a long period of time, like 5 years, 7 years, or even 10 years, but giving yourselves the authority to modify the map, if appropriate. So you don't want to necessarily have to come back and rerun new numbers every year, right? Adding numbers, subtracting numbers, but you might want to give yourself the ability, if in 4 years, all of a sudden DSS has a better database and you can start to incorporate additional poverty indicators, have the ability to do that during the time in which maybe you're mandated. So maybe every 10 years you're mandated to relook at it, but you have the ability to review it in between if necessary. Just a thought.
No, I like the idea, Ken, as long as we get the modification language correct in terms of that allows us that flexibility. I don't want to be locked in to any metric or any factors. We're able to modify. Let's be, we just got to get that language correct for purposes of modification. I would agree with that, your point in general, though.
So we can, hold on a second. I need to come out and come back.
Yeah, Chairman Chair, it looks like you were logged on twice. You are now only on once.
Thank you. All right, is this better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Are there any other questions with regard to the legislative recommendations?
Can I just suggest, I think we need to go, if we're going to vote and move and put something forward, I believe that we would need to vote on each one. Is that correct, Komla? Or how are we moving this forward? Or are we voting at the end?
Thank you, Christina. So if there are no questions or objections to any of them, the committee could entertain a motion to take a vote to submit the legislative proposal as presented. But if there are questions, then we'll have to go one at a time.
Well, I think on this map, it doesn't say, the new legislative recommendation that we heard today about redefining a DIA using an index score area. So I think that from what I heard, the council or the policy committee members are interested in doing that.
Right. So the language has to include poverty and has to include conviction rate and it has to include language around indexing the census tract. That's what I would be voting in favor of.
Okay.
So that has to be added to any proposed changes.
Any
proposed change.
Yeah, and Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, what we can do for this document and the purposes of meeting the deadlines is put a placeholder and then draft the language in greater detail to be submitted. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we have to get it as much, information and detail as possible to OPM and OTG, but I think there is still some time to tweak it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's what I would recommend, that we do a placeholder. We work very quickly to get the language done, because we could get it done by the meeting, the 26th, but it's not going to, the legislative recommendations, it's my understanding, will not be voted on by the council until we have reviewed and vetted. Correct, Christina?
Yes.
And so the council will vote on these legislative recommendations probably sometime in November.
Is there, do we intend to have the UConn team do this presentation with the whole council?
We could, if that's what you would like. Yeah, that's not a problem.
I'd like to hear what the other committee members have to say, but I think that would be helpful in terms of, trying to put this in concise language is difficult. And I think, I think that would be useful.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would recommend that we do something along the lines of what we did with the lottery and with with CONRESNIC, and set up select days and give folks opportunity to be available on select days so that they could be presented with what we saw today, because if we do it at a full council meeting, it's just going to take hours.
Yeah, that's my offer, to have office hours with the UConn team for any members of the council that would like to have a deeper discussion or get more detailed information to assist with their votes.
Okay, and in the meantime, is the intention now to draft language to reflect what Councilman Jefferson said to be the language for recertification?
Yes, we will get the language drafted. We will work with UConn to draft it, and we can present the language back to the members of the committee as well as the members of the council.
Okay, and Director Clay, when can the committee get that language? Because I think we have to vote on it, present it to the council. That correct?
No, you won't need, right now the policy committee is in discussion on the legislative recommendations. Those recommendations will then be forwarded to the office of the governor and to, I believe, OPM for review, and then come back to the full council, actually to the policy committee, and then to the full council. So the full council will not need to vote on legislative recommendations until about November, but the policy committee will still have opportunity to have discussions around the language and what the language should read, as we insert a placeholder to give us more time to develop the language.
Okay, and we can talk offline what that actually means, because I don't want to belabor anyone else's time with that, but okay. So do we need to vote on these recommendations now? What was the final result of this? This discussion?
Yeah, you do not, Christina, if I'm correct, you do not need to vote. You just need to understand what's being forwarded. This will come back to you, and you can vote to move them to the full council for vote once everything is tightened up. But it does go for a review outside of the council first.
Okay. Does that mean we need a special meeting for this?
You will not need a special meeting.
Okay.
You shouldn't need a special meeting. Like I said, it's going to come back. We're going to, over the next couple of days, we're going to draft the language with UConn. So we're going to at least get that to the committee, and you will understand that. But the full legislative package, you will not need to recommend to the council until about November. Probably at the November meeting.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So today you did, so just to clarify, today you did vote to use the map to recertify using the map with just conviction data. We will present those two maps to you using the last year and this year, the comparison at your request. And then we will vote on the recertified map at the September 26th special meeting of the council.
All right. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Are there any other things to be discussed at this point? Thank you, Christina. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Christina. I believe those are all the items on the agenda.
All the items, okay. Anything else we need to bring up? If not,
yeah, Komla, we're all set with this agenda? Just to confirm, you put it together.
Yes, ma'am. We're all set with this agenda. If the members of the committee don't have anything for the good of the order, the good chairman may call for motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Can I get a motion to adjourn, please?
So move.
Second.
Oh, second, thank you. Then the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, and thanks
Thank you, everyone.
to the
you.
team
Thank you.
from UConn. That was very very good. This is going to be a real step forward, I think, for the council. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
All right, everyone.